I think the real reframing needs to happen is what is the new possibility that's wanting to emerge. You know, we often rush for solutions to ease the pain in the moment, but I think it really requires that we sit down and reevaluate the trajectory for humanity and what a new relationship with the planet looks like. We've had a narrative that's been very apocalyptic and that's diffused out. So what happens if we change that narrative to one of possibility and charting a new course for humanity and a new level of consciousness?
Welcome to the Case for Conservation podcast, where we explore biodiversity conservation and the environment more broadly and interrogate conventional wisdom for the sake of a more robust case for conservation. I'm your host, Andre Marder. Among most legacy media outlets and on social media, narratives about environmental issues as well as social issues are noticeably more extreme than they used to be. From activists to academics and from organizations to corporations, it's become common to hear phrases like shattering Earth's natural limits, ecological meltdown, and boiling oceans. Much of this rhetoric comes from a place of genuine concern, and it usually contains important elements of truth. But it's also often emotive and inaccurate, and there's reason to believe that it could be causing more harm than good. Ragini Prasad, an environmental engineer turned coach for leaders and changemakers, has long challenged the apocalyptic narrative surrounding our environmental discourse. In her words, she wants to calm these conversations and empower individuals to rediscover their agency. In this episode, Ragini emphasizes the importance of openness to new perspectives and points out that every existential crisis presents an opportunity for individual and collective evolution. Ragini begins by explaining why she uses the tagline, "Begin with you," and more generally, why she speaks out in social media discussions against extreme points of view.
I'm in the process of setting up my own consulting coaching business. So transitioning out of engineering. And I guess for me, it's always just been about, I've done a lot of personal growth, spiritual development, and obviously being Indian as well, there's a background in that culture. So for me, you get to midlife and it's really about how you can bring those various elements together, and begin with you is what that is. So I'm in the process of kind of developing a journey to take people through that is really about reflecting on the inside, because what I've learned about change time and time again is that change is only as effective as the level of consciousness that you have, and we've been in this paradigm of where we're trying to impose change, make change happen. And it's just not very productive, because you always end up with these winners and losers, ends up with very divisive conversations. And for me, I've realized that I'm a bit of a fringe dweller, I would say. I sit in many different conversations. I'm not wedded to any one side. So obviously, naturally being an environmental professional, the climate change thing early on, I really struggled with just how divisive it was becoming, because I really just thought it was, whether you believe in climate change or not is almost by the by. And it's how do we move forward? Because I think most people care at some level about the environment. So making it about climate change, I just noticed that it was getting really divisive. So for me, it's really how do we move forward? And I think to move forward, you really need to have a strong web, not just a web of believers, but a web of people who are invested in positive outcomes, environmentally.
When was it, to be interesting to sort of as a bit of a marker, when was it that you kind of noticed that climate change in particular was becoming divisive, and where as well? Was this on Twitter or on LinkedIn or just more generally in the news?
Look, I don't use any other social media platforms, just
other than LinkedIn.
other than LinkedIn. I've got a Twitter account, but I don't use it. And, it's more about my own mental health and wanting to be present for my family and whatever else. And so I only go on LinkedIn, but even LinkedIn, I've probably been the most active in the last 2 to 3 years. But this idea about realizing how divisive it was, probably started around 2012, and it was almost in the workplace where you kind of, have these people who are believers and, they're trying to convince other people. And and I was just observing this dynamics at play, and it just didn't sit well with me. You can't force other people to see the world the way that you do.
Yeah, it's interesting that it was that long ago. I thought you were going to say some much more recent date because, the divisiveness, it seems, has a divisiveness of all political kinds has really been accelerating recently. And, everyone likes to point a finger at social media, which is probably where the finger should be pointed. But you're talking about just the issue itself, not necessarily the influence of platforms and that kind of thing, but just the issue
No,
itself, right?
and just the issue itself, but also for me, it's science is ever evolving, right? It was early on that people were saying the science is settled. And for me, I working in hydrology and hydraulics, and particularly around flooding, I've done lots of hydraulic modeling, lots of flood modeling. I understand, numerical models that are used to model the environment. I know how coarse they are. Even when you think they're fine, I know how coarse they are. So there's a lot of underlying assumptions in building these models. So for me, they're just a bit of an indicator, a bit of a guide. They're not the be all and end all. So you still need to be attuned to the environment, be observing. And from a hydraulics perspective, what I've seen time and time again is that we have got such lax development guidelines. We're developing in floodplains that have flooded for, eons. And when I've done the modeling around climate change, you notice that, yes, there is a slight increase in intensity, but it's not you don't blame the whole event on climate change.
The California wildfires are a very
Yeah.
recent, a very stark example of that as well, right?
Yeah.
Those are houses that are built right in the middle of a highly fire-prone environment, and climate change may have something to do with it, but it's certainly not the only factor, and nobody really knows how much of a factor, if any, it is. I think that's really the key thing, right?
Yeah. And I think that's the thing. It's like you want to keep an open mind because, I personally believe, yes, there is some man-made element of climate change. There's some natural element of climate change. I don't really know what the proportions are. I don't know if what we're seeing today is a response to what happened 30 years ago, 40 years ago. I don't know, we talk about net zero as the kind of panacea, the solution. And I think, okay, I feel like it's magical thinking to say, okay, we'll get to net zero and suddenly climate change will go away. There's all these unknowns in the conversation. I certainly believe we're having a negative impact on the environment, but how can we keep an open mind and yet move forward?
Mm-hmm. I wonder also, we've spoken about climate change, and that's always the dominant part of any conversation, it's a global conversation on the environment. But apart from climate change, are there other environmental issues? And this is just to kind of lay out the table of contents a little bit. Are there other environmental issues that you see as being frequently exaggerated and causing, this divisive issue that you mentioned, or are you very much focused on climate change?
Yeah, I'm aware of lots of other environmental issues. I certainly don't believe they're exaggerated. I think plastic pollution's a real problem. I think pollutants like, forever chemicals and whatever else is a real problem. And we probably don't know the extent of the problem. So, I'm keeping an open mind. I think there's lots of issues like climate change is just one aspect of, the broader environmental malaise, I guess.
Right. And then do you think that, and you said a lot of these issues are not exaggerated, but I think we probably agree that hyperbole and the way that they're addressed and described is damaging the environmental cause through impact on credibility or through any other means.
Absolutely, Andre. I think, there's the climate change narrative. You've got a whole young generation coming through now who have a real level of anxiety around the environment, anxiety around the future. And I just think if we're going to solve problems, we need people engaged. We don't need anxious, depressed people. So constantly conflating every natural disaster with climate change is really difficult for me to stomach, because climate change is so difficult to control. We can control pollutants, we can control how we build, we can control, the quality of the environment that we live in, but controlling the climate is just, for me, it's magical thinking. So I really struggle with that. And then I think just the divisiveness, what that's done is it's probably desensitized a part of the population against all environmental causes. And that for me is really troubling, because you want people engaged, you want them to care, because it's, like I said, it's not just climate change, it's chemicals, it's what we add to the environment, it's the ongoing impact on our health. There's lots of nuance to it. So when we're focused on, and most of the climate change narrative, from what I can see on LinkedIn, or, when it gets divisive, it's just this, you've got the believers and then you've got the non-believers, and they're just kind of going for it in this tit for tat, and then it's not very productive. And I think the other part of it is the solutions. The solutions are often framed in terms of intermittent renewables. I work.
So you mean
in the
intermittent energy sources?
Intermittent, yeah. So solar and wind.
With solar and wind, which means that they're not baseload energy, and there'll be times when they cannot be generated because of the lack of wind or lack of sun.
Yeah. So it's the fact that they're intermittent, but also the fact that they're framed as green and renewable. Yes, there's a certain aspect that's renewable, but the reality is you're swapping out a fossil fuel economy for a mineral economy. And we can argue about, and I get into arguments with people who are like, well, you use a lot more fossil fuels than we will minerals. And for me, as someone who's worked in the circular economy space, it's still the same linear paradigm. It's take, make, dispose. We don't really have the recycling infrastructure to recycle all these solar panels and wind turbines that end up in landfill. So to me, it's not, it's a response to people are very anxious about it. They want a solution. They want a quick fix. And they want, to assuage their anxieties. So this is kind of pitted as, as the solution to them. And I just don't think that it is. I often quote that Einstein quote about you can't, if you can't solve problems from the same mindset that created it. And unless we reflect and start changing our mindsets, we're going to create the same issues, but just in a different guise.
Mm-hmm. I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole, because it's not really the topic of discussion, but just to kind of tie a knot in that one, I mean, that would be my first retort to anyone who wanted to sort of pit renewables against fossil fuels in terms of their impact, is just the scale of it. But I actually, to be honest, I have no idea what the scale is, the mineral economy versus the fossil fuel economy. But I would assume that fossil fuel is causing a lot more damage than even all of those accumulated impacts of renewable waste and mining impacts and all that kind of thing. I'm not sure how knowledgeable you are on the stats behind that, but I would assume that they're of completely different orders of magnitude, and that's not really the main reason why renewables are potentially problematic. It's more the intermittency of wind and solar.
Yeah, look, I think for me, I don't know. I've tried to explore that, but from a energetic calorific value, fossil fuels are just so much more powerful than wind and solar. So we've got to admit that.
More dense.
Yeah, energy dense. So the question about actual scale, when we talk about emissions, people like I've worked as a consultant. I've done lots of climate mitigation strategies, and the reality is when in one of those spreadsheets, when you put in the emissions for, a solar farm or whatever, you put in zero emissions. Is it zero emissions? What happens at the end of life? What were the emissions created in their production? So I really don't know. And the fact is, we're not able to ask these questions because it's just so divisive, and we should be objective about it, because I think, I'm not saying we don't have renewables in solar and wind, because I think I've got them on my roof at home. So they certainly have their place, but to present them as the solution creates a false sense of security.
Mm-hmm. And I think you really put your finger on it when you said that we're not allowed to ask the question, right? I think that's really the key issue there is that if you do bring the topic up for discussion within a certain group of people, a very important group of people, because these are perhaps the majority of environmentalists, you're kind of seen in a negative light, and that's kind of the end of the conversation,
Yeah.
which actually is related to the next question I wanted to ask, which is why you think there is so much of that kind of mindset and so little opposition to it as well. Your voice is a pretty rare one on LinkedIn and similar platforms. On the other hand, if you go to sort of really right-wing sources of news and information, you'll find a lot of that, which is very poorly informed, and is not really a very useful part of the conversation either. But this kind of heterodox thinking seems to be pretty rare these days, and I wonder if you have any thoughts on why.
Yeah, I don't know why. I think it's my upbringing. I've never felt comfortable sitting in camps or group affiliation. Like I'm always curious. I want to understand. Like to me, it never sat well to go someone's 50%, whatever the percentage is of the population of climate deniers. Like I just cannot dismiss people that way. And so for me, the curiosity to understand them, and more often than not, it's not that they're climate deniers, they've just got other concerns. And this just isn't the priority for them. So it kind of takes me back to that Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If people are still at that security safety level, it's hard for them to consider some of these other things, like the existential crisis and the environmental crisis. So it's really about engaging with them. But yeah, I don't know why, but I think we certainly live in an ideological age. And for me, it just doesn't sit well to not ask these questions. And the fact that the sensible middle often gets cut out, it's drowned out by extreme voices on either side. And so, what my hope is, through what I post and whatever else, is to give voice to that sensible middle, to understand that there's inaccuracies on either side of the conversation, and how do we reconcile moving forward, and particularly given that I've got technical expertise in that area, so I can look at it objectively, because at the end of the day, what drives and motivates me is that we do create positive change. I deeply care for the environment, and the reason I did environmental engineering was I just didn't believe that I believe that we could live in harmony with the environment. I remember many years ago when I chose it as something that I wanted to do. It was a deep ingrained belief that there is a way for us to live that honors that environmental connection, and we've certainly lost that. But I just don't believe that the solutions that we've been proposed will take us out of that crisis.
Do you think that echo chambers and algorithms, this is kind of going back to social media a little bit, do you think that the echo chambers and algorithms, which, are designed basically to create silos and to separate people from each other, not for that purpose, but that's a result of these mechanisms. Do you think that's got a lot to do with it?
Yeah, I mean, I think algorithms are designed to give you what you want. At the end of the day, this is what the begin with you message is. You can't put the algorithm in charge of your life. You've got to be in charge of your life. You've got to see what's out there, and you've got to seek out different perspectives. At the end of the day, you've got to believe in the goodness of humanity, in the goodness of people, and the goodness of bridging divides. I mean, when I was, we're the same age. When we were younger, you did debating at school. You were given a side to debate. There wasn't a side that you picked. So sometimes you got the shitty side that you didn't really agree with, but you had to research, and you had to be compelling. So that still sticks with me, that it's important to understand different sides, and not resort to identity politics or character assassination to suppress those conversations.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting that that's happening so much in the environmental sphere, although I guess, climate change in particular has risen to the status of a global issue on a par with, some of the other hottest political issues of the day. So I guess that's a big part of it.
Yeah.
And my main focus is on biodiversity and conservation, which is always quite far behind climate change in terms of global attention.
Yeah.
But there as well, the same kind of pattern seems to be repeating itself.
Yeah.
So just before this call, as I mentioned, I was looking at your LinkedIn profile again, and I saw a post that you had posted on LinkedIn, which I think goes very much with the sort of identifier that accompanies your email, which is begin with you. And it was a post about basically how we shouldn't always be pointing fingers at corporations and capitalism. I'm not sure if you mentioned capitalism in particular, but that we shouldn't always be pointing a finger. We should be looking at ourselves and our own patterns a lot more. And that's also a very rare way of looking at things these days, because perhaps it's easier to be a victim, than it is to take responsibility. On the other hand, I think that the one really good argument that I've heard against capitalism, generally speaking, is that it allows, to a certain extent, individuals or corporations to take advantage of the addictive side of human nature. So you're arguing for taking control of that, but antagonists would say, it's very difficult or it's impossible for us to take control of that, and therefore, government regulation, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. So I think it was a post about consumerism,
Hmm.
specifically, and I just think, where does the individual, stop and the system start? That for me is a question that sticks in my mind. It's like there isn't a clear differentiator. That system is made up of individuals. And so I'm really challenged with just, okay, we'll just blame the corporations and the bad guys. And absolutely, they've got profit motives. We live in a system that's been built on that. But I think that one of the ways to diffuse the energy out of that system is where we can start taking ownership, our own sovereignty, and standing up and making different choices. And it starts with radical awareness of how are you feeding that system. And I battle within myself about this as well, because obviously, like I said before, you've got some people who are struggling to feed themselves, struggling to feed their families. So perhaps it's an elite preoccupation on my part, and it's just easy to blame the system. But I think the fact that I've got mental capacity to engage and to look at my own contributions and how I'm feeding that, and hopefully start sharing some of those stories, and it kind of diffuses out so that people start seeing, okay, well, it's not just the system. I'm not saying the system doesn't have a role to play. It absolutely does, but we have much more power than we're kind of led to believe, and the system wants us to believe that we don't have any power, and we're victims, and we need the system to kind of look after us. And I just don't believe that. I'm still trying to find words for it, but at a soul level, that just doesn't resonate with me.
Hmm.
I've seen people defy systems, and it's, you might call them outliers, but I've always been fascinated by those outliers. How have they defied the system? How have they managed to create change? And time again, what I've seen is it's not been about beating the system, shaming the system. It's actually been about creating a whole new way that people gravitate to. So I think, from that particular post, which was about consumerism, well, the system's only responding to or selling us what we're asking for. Take Amazon as an example. Like, people choose to buy from Amazon because it's cheaper.
Hmm.
So that's a decision that we're making. Yes, it's potentially more expensive to go to the bookstore, but do you need to buy as many books? If it's about trying to live a more conscious life. And I think we either make the decision to live that more conscious life, or we're going to find ourselves in really dire situations where we're going to be forced to make that decision.
You mentioned that, you sort of acknowledged that, perhaps that's sort of a point of view that's easy to have if, from a position of luxury. But I think that the majority of people who are speaking out against consumerism and for, greater regulation of corporations and all the rest of it are also people who are in a pretty privileged
Yeah.
situation. It's not coming from, the people who desperately need energy and other resources. So,
Yeah, well, I am, aware of my privilege as such, and which is why I try and, reach across the divide and start talking to different people, because it's, you've got to use your privilege wisely.
I mean, I've seen some of the responses on LinkedIn, but in other forums, what has been the reaction to that reaching out process, especially when you're reaching out to people who don't have the same view as you?
I think, and this again goes back to begin with you. I think as soon as you walk into an environment and you've got judgments, how you show up is different to how someone would show up without judgments. When you drop your judgments, people sense that. I think, there's that Martin Luther King quote, you have very little morally persuasive power with people who can feel your underlying contempt.
Because people know what you want, what
Well,
you believe.
people sense your motives, You can
Mm-hmm.
feel if someone's there genuinely wanting to talk to you or if someone's judging you. And sometimes you go in there and people have just got all this stuff on their chest that they just need to get off. And once that gets off their chest, then you can start having a more, wholesome conversation with them. But I think judgment's really corrosive, and it's hard, we all judge, I judge. It's kind of how we've been trained, and social media kind of helps you to judge. It's even worse because it puts people into camps, but I think I certainly believe that we're in a time that as humanity, we've been asked to evolve. And so I'm constantly inspired by people who can go into tough situations, who have that ability to, reach across the divide, to not judge people and to see the best in people. Because then when you do, they naturally rise to that. Time and time again, I've seen that. So I think that that's really important. And we don't really talk about that enough. We are still very much in this ideological warfare landscape where, people are this side or that side, and it's deeply damaging.
And I guess that's important. It's important for everyone to break out of that paradigm. I guess that you're reaching out to people in general. You said you're sort of moving into consulting, so I guess that you're open to whoever
Yeah.
as individuals. But where do you think it's most important to make that happen? That breaking a paradigm. So if you had global reach and you could speak to any audiences you wanted to speak to, who would be your priority audience? What kind of people and perhaps which parts of the world?
Oh, I guess leaders. I think part of where we are today is because we've had really poor leadership. You don't have courageous leadership. Most leaders that I've seen go along to get along. They're not comfortable kind of charting a new path, even though they sense that there is another pathway there. The kind of pull of conformity is really hard. So I think leaders have a really big role to play. Like it's almost like a new breed of leadership that's brave, and can really speak to different people and not get emotional about it. There's times for emotion, absolutely. But I think when you're having some of these serious conversations around the environment, you need to be able to speak to different things without getting too emotional. Once you get emotional, then it just, you really deviate from the pathway that needs to be taken.
Just before we spoke, actually, I came across a quote from the Secretary General of the United Nations. And this was a speech, part of a speech which he gave last year, 2024, sometime. I'll just read to you quickly. It's quite short. He says, "Climate change is here. It is terrifying, and it is just the beginning." And he described children's being swept away by monsoon rains, families running from flames, workers collapsing in scorching heat, etc., etc. And he was referring also to July last year as having been the hottest month on record. But the quote that really got me was, he said, "The era of global warming has ended. The era of global boiling has arrived." So when you get that kind of message, with all the weight of the UN behind it from the most senior official in the organization, backed up by countless media outlets saying the same thing in perhaps even more emotive terms, I can see why you're focused on leaders.
Yeah, well, I think it's that age-old thing of people get more hysterical when they feel powerless. When they feel powerless, they kind of wield these really old tools of control, hysteria, fear. And I just think that a new breed of leadership doesn't use that. It's more about connecting, inspiring, doing what's within your control. Because there's, the other aspect of this is there's lots of people out there doing amazing things. You just don't hear about it as much as all the disaster conversations. So one of the things that as part of my own journey is making peace that perhaps the change that I want to see might not happen in my lifetime, and being completely okay with that. And I'm still going to show up fully, because most people want change to happen overnight. And yeah, those people are looking at information. And I've seen, there's lots of information out there about how people who write, or researchers who write papers, in this area are almost incentivized to become more and more hysterical to get published. So are we really getting the information? So people seem to think that I'll only get change out of people if I scare the shit out of them. And what that's doing is it's just desensitizing people. Because here's the reality. People were saying that it's by 2015 things were going to be really bad, and people look around and go, it's not really bad. I mean, you and I know that there's some real issues out there that we need to contend with, but when you have these kind of apocalyptic narratives that get put out there, it doesn't relate to yes, you see stuff in the news, and I think that's part of the problem is wildfires have been happening for a long time. We just have access to so much more information and reporting than we've ever had. So it just looks like, it's just so much worse. And, so it's also how the information is presented.
Right. I agree on the desensitizing bit, but I would sort of tweak that a bit to say that some people are being desensitized. A certain sector of society, quite a big one, but I don't know what percentage it is, but a certain sector of society is being desensitized. Another sector of society is being energized by this narrative. And again, I don't know what proportion of society that is, but there does seem to be quite an astounding amount of support and interest in this kind of doomsaying narrative. And I'm not quite sure sort of, what separates those groups of people.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. And I don't know what the proportions are, but you certainly need a larger swathe of the population engaged on both sides. And so doomsday narrative, as opposed to, there's so many common sense things that people can do, that communities can do to change things. And also in terms of funding, like I notice here in Australia, I don't know how much you're aware of energy, but there's been so much push for hydrogen as an energy source. Now, it's still a long way off, but the amount of money that gets channeled into that, you think there's other solutions out there that are here and now solutions.
Like nuclear, for example.
Yeah, nuclear, or, biomethane. Here in Australia, there's significant amounts of organic waste. We're a food manufacturing agricultural hub. A lot of it goes to landfill. Now, you could take that and produce biomethane. There's data around it, but the reason that sector hasn't moved forward is because it gets wrapped up in the whole gas conversation. Gas is bad narrative. So it's unpacking, it's educating people. And I think the other challenge with this is you've got a lot of activists who don't have the technical expertise. They've got sound bites out of IPCC reports, out of Twitter, out of wherever, and they're suddenly a climate activist. And I think that's deeply damaging as well, because it really because they're more invested in a position, as opposed to invested in the truth and learning and whatever else. So that makes it particularly challenging.
I guess that's the downside of the democratization of media, right? This sort of social media phenomenon is that anyone, as long as they're convincing, they can become pretty successful and even financially successful on these platforms.
Yeah. You just said about people who are energized. I think perhaps, I know that the people who are desensitized are, their motives for being desensitized are, they don't believe it's as serious as, as it is. But the people who are energized by it, I think it's really important how that energy is channeled. And if you channel that energy into more outrage and more blaming and, I think that creates a real problem, because, energy is a huge conversation at the moment. Energy prices are a huge conversation. So it's really important that as we move forward, we take as many people along the journey with us. Energy prices are a valid concern. If you're struggling to feed your family, particularly in these times of inflation, like, they're valid concerns. So we need to find solutions that work for a broader spectrum of the population. We need to bring them along the journey. So for me, it's, yes, they are energized, but I'd really implore people to, think about how they channel that energy, channel it constructively, channel it to causes who are actually doing some amazing things on the ground, who are really making some, who desperately need funding, desperately need attention, because we live in a world where we're happy to have our minds hijacked by the next apocalyptic scenario.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's actually something I've been thinking about recently is how, at the local level, there's, as you say, there's lots of good stuff happening. But I guess another side effect of the democratization of media, for lack of a better term, is that it means that anyone from anywhere can comment on the situation globally, the kind of
Yeah.
global, overarching, abstract view of things, rather than sort of focusing on where they can really make a difference. And I mean, I guess I'm guilty of this as well. This podcast is very much global in its reach, but one has to be careful with that kind of narrative because you can very easily oversimplify and be very simplistic in your arguments.
Yeah, it's and I'm really wary of it. Like, even with the LA fires, I try not to comment on it too much because I really don't know exactly what's happened on the ground, and I'm aware that it's a fire-prone region. And I'm also aware that there's lots of factors at play, but it's really important to not be seen as the expert in an area that I'm not really an expert.
All right. I did have one last question, but I think we've kind of covered it already. But that was, what do we do about all this? Is there anything extra to say about, how do we, and when I say this, I'm talking about the public slash media slash leader tendency to use hyperbole when it
Yeah.
comes to key environmental issues.
Yeah, look, I think for me, it's really actually about talking about it, talking about it in a sensible, unoffensive way. And what I've found time and time again with my posts and whatever else, there's lots more people who are supportive than they're not. And there's a lot more people who feel, that they've been shut down or feel too scared that they're going to be attacked. I've kind of moved past that point because I'm reasonably confident in what I'm sharing. And so for me, it's really about helping people find the confidence, because I think that there are lots more people in the sensible middle than there are at the extremes. And when we can give those voices energy, that's how we really move forward, because I think the extremes have us hamstrung.
Right. So what is it that you would like those people to do? People who you're kind of able to have an influence over. Would you like them to be pushing against hyperbolic narratives? Would you like them to be kind of talking facts to opinion, or what would you like to see them doing? Or is it more of a personal development kind of?
Yeah, look, I think it's a bit of everything. We have to become really aware of where we're getting hijacked by the hyperbole and try to maintain an open mind. So it really starts with us, because if you've got more people talking, more people sharing, then you've got more people coming together trying to make something happen. I apart from starting my own business, I do work, I head up a small not-for-profit called the Victorian Bioenergy Network. And, as I've already mentioned, bioenergy is not well developed here in Australia at all, and I'm aware of the narrative around bioenergy is burning wood, or, we're going to take away from food production. I'm aware of some of the negative narratives, but from where I stand, there is significant amounts of waste being produced at the moment. There's
Lost opportunities, basically.
Yeah, lost opportunity. So what I found is, I started in the role, 12 to 18 months ago, and there was so much resistance out there. And in 12 to 18 months, we've managed to really shift, quite a bit of it. I mean, we've still got more work to do, but it's been on the ground, going and talking to people, sharing different stories, sharing different perspectives, and being open and honest. We're not saying that this is going to solve everything, but this certainly has opportunities that we need to consider. I mean, as far as nuclear, I don't know enough about nuclear, but I do know about biomethane. And, I understand from a circular economy perspective, if we can use waste that's generated here to generate gas and then use that gas, which would, if those things are going to decompose naturally and produce gas that we don't capture, then that's a wasted opportunity. And then if we produce either composts or digestates through that process that can then be put back onto the land, that can be a win-win solution. But it really takes people opening up their mind, because I think minds have been captured. You see journalism is so poor these days, mainstream journalism, and it just really feeds that binary narrative that's out there.